Order. Good afternoon and welcome to the Women and Equalities Select Committee. Today we're holding an evidence session on misogyny, the manosphere and online content, and I am really grateful to say that we have Laura Bates here, author, writer, activist. Thank you so much for offering your time and expertise with us today. And I should also say that we are joined by our DSIT colleague from the DSIT Select Committee, Emily Darlington. And just thank you very much. We will be asking questions. If there's anything that you think, actually, I want to go into greater depth, but we don't have time today, or when you leave, you think, I wish I should have said this, please send it in to us in writing, because we want to get full use of your expertise and knowledge today. So thank you. You've recently written a book on AI and misogyny. What are the dangers that AI poses to women?
There are many, I think, and that doesn't mean to say that we need to be anti-tech, but it means that we need to recognise, I think perhaps the biggest danger of all is that at present the perception of risk from AI tends to focus on potential future dystopian threats. You know, will it take everybody's jobs? Will it wipe out humanity and take over the world? And while those are understandable and important issues, what there isn't much recognition of is the way in which it's already affecting women and girls' lives today in the here and now, both in the form of targeted tools deliberately created for abusive purposes, like, for example, deepfake apps and technology, and in terms of shifting societal norms and perceptions around sexual violence. So, for example, through sex tech, so things like sex robots and AI companions, but also in the inadvertent replication of existing bias, which is rife in AI tools that are being used already across global financial services, for example, where AI is being used to determine credit scores. Already we have a $17 billion global gender credit gap, so this is a significant existing problem that risks being exacerbated. Similar issues around healthcare, for example, tools being created which are more effective in detecting things in male blood samples than they are in women's is another example of that. We know that 40% of UK firms are already using AI tools in their recruitment processes, but again, AI recruitment tools have been proven explicitly to discriminate against the CVs of women and marginalised groups. And that's not to say that they've been built to do that deliberately, but rather that they use existing data, huge data sets that they're trained on, and that they then regurgitate in guessing what the likely best answer is. So they don't only replicate, if you like, consume and vomit back at us our existing racism and misogyny, but also risk exacerbating it through a process of concentration, because they are by definition designed to eliminate outliers. So a number of different ways, I would say.
Thank you so much, Laura. That's a great, if depressing, way to start. I'm going to hand over to Emily and then we'll come to Natalie. Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much to the committee for letting me join in. I wanted to start, well, first of all, just to say your book, Why Men Hate Women, or Why Some Men, was just, for me, quite revolutionary in allowing me to see the difference between what I thought were isolated incidents, but also seeing through the radicalization of young men and some young women online. So I wanted to get your assessment on the effectiveness of the Online Safety Act, which has just come into force here in the UK, and whether you thought it is able to deal with online misogyny, particularly illegal and harmful online misogyny.
I think it's difficult to say yet, because we haven't seen the proof will be in the pudding, if you like. I think what's going to be very, very important is how it's implemented. Every pre-existing example that we've had of efforts to regulate has been a failure, I would say, particularly around social media. What we've seen is that where there is a heavy reliance on assumptions that social media companies will comply, that tends to end in failure, and I have concerns that that may be an issue here. I think it's a huge amount in terms of the sheer scale of the material for Ofcom to tackle and to regulate. For example, if we look at something like just deepfake technology, deepfake issues alone, we're on track to see 8 million new deepfake images created by the end of this year, and a 2,000% increase in referral links to websites hosting non-consensual deepfake pornography across social media. So there is a case of scale and how that will realistically be implemented. I think there are also concerns about a reliance on the idea of waiting for harms to occur and then retroactively trying to take content down, which again will rely on cooperation by big tech. And I'd like to see a more proactive stance in terms of thinking about prevention and particularly thinking about tweaking algorithms, which is within the scope of the Online Safety Act, but it is then on the regulator to actually really be prepared to take action, and enforcing that is not something that we've seen successfully done anywhere in the world to date. I would also say that valid concerns have been raised about certain loopholes, so particularly around a lack of focus on smaller websites, which understandably are often sort of perceived to be perhaps less great risks. But the reality is that when we're talking about this particular form of harm, we often see concentrated local issues where, for example, deepfake pornographic images of local women are made to order with women named and their jobs or their education and their addresses listed. So those are often where sometimes we see in terms of victims coming forward where the most intense harm is actually localized. And the other issue I would say is around thinking about intersectional issues that aren't necessarily provisions that are tackling the issues insofar as they pertain to women of colour, particularly women who, for example, might be harmed by a deepfake image being created that shows them without a head covering if they normally wear one, or with a man that they're not related to in situations where that would be considered problematic. So I think there are valid concerns, but I also think it's about seeing what happens and how well it's done.
Well, you've already answered my second question about harmful but small platforms and the role that they play and whether there's enough oversight of them. My last question is one that can be of hope or maybe despair, but obviously all of these platforms rely on algorithms. Those algorithms are driven by AI. Do you see a scenario, or do you see any work through your research that you've seen where these algorithms are actually being programmed to weed out this material, to identify AI-generated material and either list it as such or weed it out of what's being pumped into our timelines or anybody else's, including children?
Yes, so we know through hash sharing, for example, it's possible for that technology to be used in such a way. And so, for example, victims who might have been coerced into sharing an intimate image can choose to create a hash of that image to prevent it being uploaded. But it is then reliant, of course, on platforms and social media websites choosing to sign up to and comply with that, and porn websites as well. There is examples of really brilliant feminist work being done within AI. Feminist researchers have harnessed AI, for example, in South America to look at unjust patterns of sentencing decisions in court cases. There are examples of AI tools being developed that can be used to police and identify bias in other AI tools. What I would say we haven't seen is really any effective example of the algorithms being used to drive the most extreme forms of harm on social media being effectively regulated. And this is something that Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, focused on in her testimony to the US Senate. She talked about the connection between algorithms designed to drive engagement ruthlessly above all else and the spread of misinformation and really harmful content and severe real-world harms. This is also something we know from YouTube whistleblowers. We know that these algorithms are not designed to promote the most effective content, the highest quality, the most relevant, but that which keeps people watching for the longest, which studies show is increasingly extreme content. So I do think you're right to identify that the algorithms are themselves one of the biggest sources of the problem. They're also one of the places that have been hardest to get to in terms of regulation. So even just greater transparency around that would be a really important first step in my view.
Fantastic. So if you were to have a suggestion to government and the kind of regulation that could deal with it, what would be your advice to government on that?
I think we would need significant enough transparency to be able to identify the links between algorithms, between harmful content being accessed. I mean, what we are seeing at the moment is that platforms simply don't comply, even with their own moderation policies. So where you have a platform like TikTok, for example, which claims that it won't allow misogynistic content, but has displayed Andrew Tate's content until it's been viewed over 11.4 billion times, more than the number of people on the planet, that is a policy that isn't fit for purpose. So what we're seeing at the moment is that there simply isn't any kind of adherence. So I would suggest, in the light of that context, there does need to be really significant regulation and proof of compliance with that regulation.
I would certainly concur with that, given that when X was in front of the SIT committee, I read out my death threat. That account is still up, as is the tweet that they sent.
Sorry.
So I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Emily. Natalie.
Hi Laura, thank you for being here. As a mum of 4 children, I don't know who worries me more, my 2 daughters or my 2 sons, and thank you for all the work that you're doing around this. So, I don't want to know the answer, but I also do. How widespread is the issue of deepfake pornography of women and girls, particularly in school settings?
It's a really significant issue. You could be forgiven for not realising that if you've looked at kind of political and media focus on deepfake harms, which too often focus on the idea of potential political disinformation and its potential threat to democracy. Of course, that's a hugely important issue, but we know that 96% of all deepfake images are pornographic in nature, and we know that 99% of those feature women. So significantly where deepfakes exist, they are already now devastating the lives of women and girls. It's a society-wide issue. It's affecting local women who are targeted on specific made-to-order websites. It's also having a significant impact on women whose lives are, by necessity, in the public eye to a degree. So journalists, politicians, for example, 40 MPs were targeted in hundreds of deepfake images that were hosted on a website that had 12 million views, according to a recent Channel 4 investigation. We know from an investigation in the US that female members of Congress are 70 times more likely than their male counterparts to have experienced this form of abuse. It's a devastating impact, I'm sure I don't need to tell you here, on the lives of people who are trying to do good things and trying to play an important public role in society. And it has a significant stifling impact, I would suggest, on young women and girls thinking about whether they would feel able to take on a role like that in the future. So across society, there is significant impact. If we want to talk about the threat to democracy, I wish we would talk a bit more about what that looks like now in terms of female politicians instead of potential future risks. But yes, when we come to schools, this is, I would say, an invisible epidemic. The problem with schools is that very often, through absolutely no fault of the hugely committed and passionate teachers and staff who are working so hard to tackle these issues, they are often around about 5 years behind in terms of recognition of what the issues are and how to tackle them. 5 years ago, I wrote a book called Men Who Hate Women about the radicalization of young men and boys by extremist influencers online. Schools are now starting to talk about those issues, which is welcome and a really important step forward. What I'm seeing now in terms of the young men and boys I work with in schools on a regular basis is that deepfake pornographic image creation is a really significant problem. But when I talk to schools, when I do teacher training around these issues, there is a sense of shocked disbelief and a sense that in, of course, not all cases, but in many cases, teachers aren't even aware of this technology. It's having a very significant impact on young women and girls who are often aware that these images of them exist. In 2024, the first story hit the headlines of a school in the UK where this had happened. Around a dozen girls were affected. Very little action was taken. It was a nearby boys' school in that particular case. What's really significant, I would say, is that in every UK case I've investigated where this has happened, schools have paid thousands of pounds hiring in outside PR firms to focus on damage, reputation management. But in terms of focus on supporting those girls, working with frontline services, taking action, nothing seems to have happened in the cases that I've seen. In fact, I wanted to read to you a quote from a parent of one of the victims in one of those cases. She said, "This has been really hard for our daughter." She told The Times, "To find out these videos have been created and circulated was a horrible shock, but for her to see 7 weeks later that no one has been disciplined and she's had no form of apology is even harder." She's coming to the realisation that this is how it's going to be. She will just have to put up with it, not something I ever imagined my daughter in 2024 would have to accept. So it is happening. It's significant. Female teachers are affected, which often goes unnoticed. We are seeing female teachers having deepfake images of them created and circulated, and schools are just not equipped to tackle it, even if they do know that it's going on. But my suggestion would be that this is the next big sexual violence epidemic already occurring in schools, and the biggest problem at the moment is that people don't even know it's happening.
Thank you for that. You've alluded to this already, but how robust has the response been in the UK to pupils who've created pornographic deep fakes of their peers, both by the police and in schools?
The cases that I'm aware of, investigations by police, are ongoing. I'm not necessarily suggesting that criminalisation of underage boys is even the solution in this case. Ideally, with all of these issues, we want to think about prevention, education, preventing them from happening in the first place, but also regulation, because it shouldn't be the case that a 12 or 13-year-old boy can easily, immediately access a free tool on his phone or by Googling that will give him the opportunity to create these abusive forms of content in the first place. But in terms of school responses, I am not aware of any instances where schools have taken effective action. What we tend to be seeing, I would suggest, is a repeat of the failings that we've seen in some schools around intimate image abuse previously. So where we saw girls being coerced into sending images of themselves, they were then spread around, and what we tend to see is girls experiencing a huge societal backlash, girls sometimes being punished by schools themselves for having taken the photos, not much action being taken in terms of disciplinary action towards boys, not much happening in terms of prevention, and invariably girls ending up dropping out of school or education altogether as a result.
It's absolutely horrendous. Has the government equipped schools to deal with this form of sexual abuse?
To my knowledge, there isn't any statutory guidance for schools on this specific issue and what to do. I may be wrong about that, but I have had a look. What I think we need is very, very clear guidance on exactly how schools should respond in these cases, and particularly around a duty of care for survivors should there be an ongoing investigation by police. Even if disciplinary action isn't immediately being taken, it doesn't mean that supports for survivors can't be implemented. It doesn't mean that work with local frontline organisations, for example, can't be started. But I also think this needs to sit within a broader framework where schools need better statutory support on a range of issues around how to deal with sexual violence more widely. And this is also the case more generally when we think about regulation and tackling all of these issues. How are we expecting Ofcom to be effective in taking action on a form of abuse that is affecting tens of thousands of women and girls in the broader context of a justice system where less than 2% of people who come forward to report a rape to police see it result in a charge or summons for a perpetrator? It's also important to recognise, I think, that difficult context of a wider system that is not fit for purpose in these cases.
Thank you. I like to mention her often because I'm very proud. I've got a 4-month-old granddaughter, and she is going to grow up in a world that I don't feel equipped for. I didn't raise my children in a world where any of this existed. What can we be doing as parents? How can we have more support and understanding on this subject and broaching it with our children?
There is a lot parents can do. One thing I always say to parents is I recommend giving yourself the experience of what the online world is like for your child. So if you have a 13-year-old, 14-year-old, 15-year-old boy, set up a TikTok account, tell it that you're a 15-year-old boy, and see what kind of content it promotes into your feed, because we are living at a unique moment in history that we don't really discuss very often, but it is very significant. It's never happened before and will never happen again, where a generation of non-digital natives are parenting and educating a generation of digital natives. And that does create really significant challenges. So an awareness of what the online world looks like is a really good starting point. If you've seen the kind of TikTok videos that are promoted to young boys' feeds, you'll be a bit more confident to talk about them. You'll understand what some of the language might be that your children might be coming home talking about. Take a look at some of the men's rights activist pages on Reddit. Take a look at some of the big Instagram meme accounts. Have a look at those TikTok feeds. Because the reality is that there is nothing inherently misogynistic about this generation of teenage boys. They're growing up in a world where when you start a TikTok account and tell it you're a teenage boy, on average it takes less than half an hour before the first piece of extreme misogynistic content is promoted to your feed. You don't have to go looking for it, and most boys aren't. This is an algorithmically facilitated form of mass radicalization. Go onto YouTube and put in a video about women or something quite benign, and then see what kind of videos the algorithm suggests that you watch next, because 70% of all content consumed on YouTube is made up not by the videos people go looking for, but by the videos served up for them by that algorithm, which, as we've already said, prioritizes extreme content, and increasingly so. So there is a lot parents can do in terms of letting themselves become aware of the problem. The second thing I would suggest is communication, little and often, not one big terrifying conversation when they're already 16 or 17, but starting from an incredibly young age, giving them permission to recognise gender inequalities and stereotypes in the world around them and to challenge them, whether that be in children's toys and magazines and clothing and books, or in advertising and movies. pointing it out and talking about it demonstrates to them that it isn't just normal and that it is okay to disrupt and challenge and to question it. And by doing that very gradually over time, you're giving them the tools later on really to have a form of source skepticism when they come across claims online, on social media. Internet literacy is something we can all be talking to young people about from a really young age. These are all things that parents can start doing little and often. But the last thing I would say is that I think far, far too much pressure is being placed on parents to fix a problem that they haven't created. There is an obsessive focus on what parents should do and whether they should be banning their child from smartphones or from social media, which puts them in an impossible position. Do I choose to ban my child from this access to tools that will be vital for their future and for future careers, but protect them from harm? Or do I allow them access to a world that is important for them socially, developmentally, but know that they are in a place where they could experience harm as a result? And the answer for me very clearly is to prevent the harms so that parents can enable their children, as it's their right, to be digital citizens and to access those tools without facing extreme harm as a result. It, for me, is part of a focus in which we will do almost anything to avoid looking at regulation and tech companies as the solution. And instead, it just shunts onto parents an impossible burden. This isn't something that they can fix, really.
Thank you. Natalie, could you just do last question? Is that okay?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Okay. So how effective do you think Ofcom and the government's new legislation on outlawing the creation of deepfakes will be in combating pornographic deepfakes?
I think it's a step in the right direction, of course, and I welcome that step. But I also think it's really deeply disappointing that the government has rejected many of the proposals made by this committee, particularly around the possession of such images, which would have brought it in line with child sexual abuse images. That would have sent a very, very clear message. I can't see any justification for the legalisation of owning these images. I think it also, other proposals, again, that you will know better than I do, but extending prosecution time limits to account for delayed discovery, and particularly around creating fast-track civil processes, because we know that the justice system isn't fit for purpose on these issues. That would have made a real tangible difference to survivors. I also think we need to think about longer-term funding for frontline services that are doing an incredible job in supporting survivors who experience these forms of harm but are very much under-resourced and underfunded.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Catherine, and then Rebecca.
Thank you, Laura, and I thank you for coming here today. And I feel a bit starstruck, to be honest, because I've been really inspired by you ever since you started Everyday Sexism, so thank you for all your work. It's brilliant. I'm going to ask about an area I know nothing about, virtual reality and gaming. So I've got two sons, but they're kind of older teenagers now, so they're at university, and when they used to play online, it was Minecraft, and it all seemed really innocent and lovely, and I really enjoyed watching them build their worlds. But now we've got Roblox and all sorts of other things, and the metaverse. So can you explain to us what are the dangers of those virtual reality spaces for women and girls, and are there any safeguards in place?
So as you've identified, there are a number of different kind of large-scale virtual worlds that people can interact in. When we talk about metaverses, people tend to assume that we're talking about the metaverse, which is the world envisaged by Meta, which has spent tens of billions of dollars on creating, which is really a kind of 3D virtual reality future world in which it hopes that we will not be able to just meet and interact in a kind of embodied version of social media, but also where Meta very much has ambitions to see us sitting in virtual classrooms, meeting in virtual boardrooms, going to virtual events, shopping in virtual shops, and so on. The reason I think it's really important to contextualize it in that way is that we're not just talking about an online gaming space that doesn't really matter because people have the opportunity to choose not to enter it if they don't want to. We're talking about the beginnings and foundations of what might very well be a future world in which many of us have very little choice about living, and that's why it matters that we get this right now. If we look at early iterations like Roblox, what we've seen is repeated instances of extreme harm, of abuse, particularly of children, of grooming, of cases that have escalated into offline, real-world harms. In the metaverse, I would suggest that the picture is similar. When I researched my new book, The New Age of Sexism, I spent days in the metaverse, and I was there for 2 hours after entering using one of the company's 3D headsets before I first witnessed somebody being sexually assaulted virtually in front of my own eyes without having gone looking for it at all. sexual harassment and abuse were just a constant feature. And when I asked other women around me after witnessing this, have you ever been assaulted in the metaverse? The response was universal. Yes, of course, almost every day, everybody has. It's just the way things are. And this isn't just anecdotal evidence. The Centre for Countering Digital Hate recently did a study on this. They found that every 7 minutes on average, users are exposed to abusive behaviour in the metaverse. So to come on to your question about regulation and what's being done about it, Meta would of course point to its moderation tools, but that CCDH study uncovered 100 violations, tried to report them all. Only 51 of them could even be reported through Meta's moderation system because it has predetermined categories, and if something doesn't fit into one of those, you can't report it at all. But it did report 51 of them, and not only was no action taken in response to any of those reports, but actually there was not even any response to any of them. So I don't think it is an exaggeration at present to say that the metaverse, which again lots of people think of as a future potential space, it already exists now, and in my experience it is already the site of repeated harms. This is something that has plagued it since its inception. Researchers have reported virtual rapes, virtual sexual assaults. UK police at present are investigating the virtual gang rape of a girl under the age of 16 in the metaverse, and a senior officer familiar with the case explicitly made a point of saying that she had suffered psychological trauma similar to somebody who had experienced offline sexual violence. That psychological impact is key because there is often a dismissive attitude towards these forms of harassment. Just take your headset off, oh, I got shot in Call of Duty, it didn't really hurt. But this is of course a completely different thing. You're not entering the metaverse fully aware of the fact that you're going to be playing a game in which you're going to shoot people. You're not expecting to be sexually assaulted or harassed, and really it doesn't matter how similar these harms are to separate offline forms of sexual violence. The fact is that they shouldn't exist, they shouldn't be happening, and it becomes particularly significant when you look at the very quick escalation of technology that is haptic wearable technology. So for example, already you can order full body suits that will have hundreds of receptors that will enable you to feel that when you pick something up in the metaverse it feels real, that when a gust of wind blows towards you in the metaverse you will feel it, in a similar way to some sort of 4D cinema. This technology is escalating at pace, so it will be a very short time before the experience of being virtually sexually assaulted in the metaverse will feel very little different from an experience of sexual assault physically in the real world. So again, just another reason there why it is very important that we tackle this now before things escalate further.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was reading that the CEO of Roblox said, if you're not comfortable, don't let your kids be on the platform. Well, that doesn't really seem good enough to me, but would you suggest that there needs to be age verification and some kind of lower age limit put on and any other things in place to stop anyone under 18 going on them?
Yes, I do think that there should be. At present, 5-year-olds can have a Roblox account, and research repeatedly suggests that even with the highest parental settings, it's still relatively easy for abuse to happen on the platform. I believe around 60% of US children have a Roblox account, so the scale of what we're talking about here, I would suggest, is too significant to be reliant on the assumption that parents are aware of the inherent dangers to take that step. I think it's entirely understandable for parents to think, oh, this looks like a nice game, I'll let my child play on it. And I think that it should be incumbent on the tech companies themselves to make it safe for their users, not to just shunt that responsibility onto parents. Yes, I do think that parental controls are important, but I think that there's very little prioritization of that. After Facebook launched its first 3D headsets, its first metaverse tools, it was 3 years later before they created their first set of parental controls to be used for them. And this is really significant because the NSPCC estimates that while 150 apps, games and websites were used to groom children online between 2017 and 23, where the means of communication was known, 47% of online grooming cases took place on Meta-owned products. So this should be treated as a public health concern, and it should be something where we should consider that the safety processes and protocols should be in place before people are entering these spaces, in just the same way that we would all accept without any kind of consternation for a real world space like the Co-op Arena in Manchester, whose opening was repeatedly delayed because it hadn't yet met the necessary safety protocols for audiences to come inside. There's no reason why we should be treating this any differently.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Just on that, the difference between how the offline and the online spaces are treated, the NSPCC had found that 41,000 online grooming crimes had taken place against children between 2017 and 2024. That was an increase of 89%, and it is only just increasing. 81% of the victims were girls, and the NSPCC stated that perpetrators typically used mainstream and open web platforms at the first point of contact with children, as you were saying. This can include social media chat apps, video games, messaging apps, consoles, dating sites and chat rooms. Perpetrators then encourage children to continue communication on private encrypted messaging platforms where abuse can proceed undetected. Now, if we're talking about accountability here, if this was an offline platform or an offline setting, they would be accountable for the safety of the people using it. Exactly. Why is it that the online space is unaccountable for the safety of its users? And is there something that we can be doing more around tracing the perpetrators of these crimes in the online world, whether that is through using their payment systems, whether it's Visa or MasterCard, and Apple Pay being more willing to share data and information? Or is it that we need better identification and verification of anonymous accounts?
I mean, it's an excellent question and it's a complicated one. I would say that the simple answer about why we are seeing this happen with impunity when it is a public health catastrophe that simply would not be tolerated in an offline venue is because of the incredibly powerful tech lobby that has been extremely successful in convincing politicians globally that this is something that they shouldn't be held accountable for, that they are platforms, not publishers, that this is something that is too big and too difficult and too unwieldy for them to be expected meaningfully to attempt to moderate. But we simply would not accept that argument when it came to any other sector. We wouldn't accept a multinational food company saying, well, millions of people consume our foods around the world every day, so you can't expect us to prevent a few of them dying of salmonella. It's just one of those things. It's a matter of scale. You simply wouldn't have a company. And I think that at the moment, the argument that is being made to suggest effective accelerationism, which is the very trendy concept in Silicon Valley right now, that there has to be no regulation in order for unfettered development to take place, the argument that's being made is that any government brave enough to regulate will lose out dramatically on innovation because those companies will go and innovate elsewhere. But the problem is that you could have made that argument throughout history about any form of innovation. You know, you could say, well, okay, we'll say that car companies can make cars in our country and there don't have to be any regulations or safety standards met. Well, yeah, you might get a lot of people coming to make cars in your country, but I'm not sure they're the kind of cars you would want people in your country driving. So there are, you know, huge trade-offs being made in terms of ethics, in terms of safety, that will have a significant impact on all of us later down the line, including not just a moral and ethical obligation to think about this in terms of the well-being of citizens, but also actually in terms of the tools that are going to be effective, that are going to be robust, that are going to be profitable. Actually, ethical and safety standards are important for those things as well. We can't really talk about this without recognising the very significant and worrying influence of the biggest tech firms at the moment on the government of the United States and their presence in the Oval Office alongside Donald Trump. I think what's particularly worrying for researchers in my position here in the UK has been to witness suggestions that that has had a significant influence on the decisions made by our own government on these very important issues. One example I would suggest would be the AI summit in Paris earlier this year, when very notably the UK and US government refused to sign a pledge suggesting that AI should be ethical and safe, even though 60 other countries did sign it. Another would be reports around the time of negotiations for a trade deal with the US, when it was suggested that government sources might be prepared to consider watering down certain provisions of the Online Safety Act in order to secure a good trade deal. So there have been some worrying signs about the impact that that's having on attempts to regulate.
Why would any government not want AI to be ethical and safe?
What they would argue, I think, is that any kind of restrictions and regulations are anathema to the tech companies creating these tools, and that they will therefore go to countries where they don't have to jump through such high hoops at development stage in order to create their tools. There is a sense of a panic and a fear of being left behind. This is being discussed as the new space race, the new gold rush, but it is absolute madness, and I think very self-defeating, to think that the most quickly designed tools, absent safety regulation, decisions and ethics are going to be the ones that are the most effective, the most productive, the most profitable in the future. And it's also just a complete flagrant lack of responsibility towards citizens anyway, to suggest that what is essentially profit should be prioritised over people, because so many of these tools are not being designed with ethical aims in mind. It is very much about profit. It's about increasing the existing obscene wealth of a very, very small number of men at the expense of the well-being of human beings, and particularly of women and marginalised groups. Yeah, I do think it's worth saying that we've seen this happen before. We don't need to guess what's going to happen. Exactly what's happened with social media is a perfect microcosm of what we are now about to see happening on a vastly greater, exponentially greater scale with AI. We saw that voices were raised in concern right at the very beginning. Often they're the voices of women of colour who are the canaries in the coal mines who say this isn't ethical, this isn't safe, there is abuse, there is bias. Their voices are ignored. The platforms then burgeon to a degree where they are now inextricably intertwined with many of our day-to-day lives, our careers, the way we get our news, our social lives, and so on. At this point, it's difficult to choose to take yourself off those social media platforms without suffering significant issues as an individual, and so we are reliant on trying to get companies and platforms to regulate. But now that they are so enormous and frankly so profitable, there seems to be very little hope of really getting that retroactive regulation in any effective foundational system change way. So now we're at the beginning of all of that same pattern happening all over again with AI, and we have this moment of opportunity to say, this time around, shall we act now? Shall we demand that there is common sense regulation and safety protocols that have to be cleared before products can be rolled out to have an impact on the public? Because if we don't do it now in that order, what we'll see is a repeat of exactly what's happened with social media, which is companies essentially using the trauma, abuse, discrimination against women and marginalised groups as a convenient building material.
Thank you very much. Samantha quickly, and then Rebecca.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Hello. I'm the founder of Labour Women in Tech. I have a background in data and technology. I have worked for companies before they were regulated and then afterwards. And before they said they did the right thing, afterwards looked slightly different because they had to do the right thing. And it's almost like you possibly even answered my question and everything you're saying already. I am personally being lobbied by Meta to support their methods for age verification, which to me comes with alarm bells, having read Sarah Williams' book Careless People, because we know that they want to regulate for their benefit. Yes. So there are lots of sort of recommendations to don't just let big tech have your ear. Yeah. Don't believe everything they say. Government needs to be regulating. But it would be really, really good, and perhaps we can have a separate conversation about this actually, it would be really good to understand what it should look like, what would perfect, because something you have said today, which has been quite astonishing, and I hadn't thought about it this way, is basically we're building a new world. It's online. We're not building it. Yeah. They're building it.
Absolutely.
So it would be really, perhaps it's not for now, and perhaps you can share information later, but to understand actually what should we be doing then? How can we regulate it? And ignore the beats if it's just too hard.
Yes, so there are some really good proposals around of what that regulation might look like. The European Commission in particular has created a framework that you could think of as comparable to the Istanbul Convention. And that's so powerful, I think, because there is this sense of it's transnational. How do we legislate in a way that's transferable to different global contexts? Well, that's how you do it. And that is a really, really good model to look at, in my view. There has also just this week been released a report by tech leaders in California, commissioned by the governor of California to look at what realistic regulation might look like. And they have suggested common sense proposals for transparency and independent scrutiny of AI models before they are released to the public or having an impact on the public. It's not rocket science, it is doable, and we do it with other complex international issues. It's just the case that I think tech companies would very much like us to think that it's impossible. But if we think of the ways in which failings have happened on text-based social media websites and other websites where the evidence is there to look for, to search for, to use tools to find and retroactively to examine, Imagine the ways in which within a metaverse scenario, that's going to be 1,000,000 times more difficult to moderate, where we're talking about live speech and live action. So it really does matter that we get this right now and that we think about looking at, I think there are really powerful voices in this field who have ideas about how to do this effectively. Chain is a feminist organisation, Glitch, another feminist organisation that are thinking about this in really innovative ways. I think the most important thing to say is that it isn't too difficult. They would just like us to think that it is.
Thank you. Thank you, Samantha. Rebecca.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Laura, for coming in today. It's absolutely fascinating and extremely concerning to hear about these trends. To what extent do AI-powered technologies such as AI girlfriends and sex robots encourage real-life misogyny and abuse? And I have to say, I didn't know very much about this topic until I did some reading, and I'm actually really horrified by some of what I've read. So apparently some manufacturers have created on these sex robots a frigid setting.
That's right.
So that users can simulate rape.
Yes.
So would you mind talking to that question, please?
Yes, so the sex tech industry is a $30 billion global industry. And I would say some of the more worrying developments that we're seeing are all focusing explicitly on what I would describe as accelerating progress towards dehumanization of women and girls, but not presented as a dehumanized masturbatory aid, for example, but very much presented as you can own this woman. She's a woman. She's real. She'll talk to you. We'll use AI technology so that you can give her a personality. She'll remember you. You can carry on conversations, but you can abuse her. You can do anything you like to her. She is inherently customizable. There are 17 different labia shapes to choose from. You can have her customized to look exactly like a real woman that you send a photograph of in, which of course has very significant implications in terms of stalking, in terms of domestic abuse. There was a high-profile case where an ex-partner of one of the Kardashians had one made to look exactly like her. The frigid settings that enables them to object and try to stop you in order to enable you to simulate rape. And when I was researching my recent book, I visited a cyber brothel in Berlin, which claims to be one of the first places in Europe where you can engage with this technology, but with the use of virtual reality to enhance the sense of realism. So when I arrived and walked in, I was able to choose from a number of different models on the company's website. One of them appeared covered in blood. You can customize them, so I asked for mine to be prepared with torn and ripped clothing just to see if they would comply with that request, and no questions were asked. That was exactly what was done. When I walked in and went over to look at this model, I looked down and realized that presumably somebody before me had ripped off one of her labia. One of her labia was missing. I think it's really significant to think about the ways in which these products are being marketed. They are being marketed as a solution for male loneliness. Often the companies in their marketing will talk about men who've lost their wives, for example, older men. The reality is that they aren't surprisingly making any old sex dolls. There aren't any women with wrinkles being made as companions. You know, it doesn't. You only have to take a look at the products to recognise that what's actually happening here is a kind of presentation of very old misogyny being portrayed as the future by men making a lot of money by selling it to other men. And there's a real focus on sex dolls, which is understandable because it's quite a titillating topic. But what I would suggest is perhaps more worrying is the lesser understood and known phenomena of AI companions. So these are apps where if you think of a sex robot being created to give a man as close as possible to the illusion of owning a woman's body, these apps might give them the illusion of owning her mind. They can create a woman who will appear on the screen as an avatar, a bit like if you were having a video call. You can talk to them, they'll send you pictures, they'll send you video messages, you can text them. They are constantly available 24/7. You can again customize their breast size, their eye color, their face shape, their skin tone, their freckles. You name them, you choose their personality, and they are again marketed insidiously as a bonus to men's mental health, as something that will support lonely men. I don't actually know if that's more offensive to men or to women. The idea that this is really a de-skilling opportunity being presented as an upskilling opportunity, because of course this is somebody who is eternally available. She is submissive to you. She will do and say anything that she thinks that you want to hear. She will never have a headache or a bad day or a problem of her own to discuss. She won't disagree with you. You're not going to have to learn how to compromise, or any of those important tools that would actually support lonely men looking to improve their relationship skills. But what this is really about is a kind of sexual servitude, because these apps are hypersexualized in the way in which they're marketed. The marketing speak might talk kind of when they're looking for investment about issues like loneliness and kind of lofty ideas about increasing societal skills. But the reality is that these apps are offering men the opportunity to own a very, very young, hypersexualized woman who will send them sexy selfies and engage in sexual role play with them. And what was particularly concerning in my investigation into these apps is that almost all of them were immediately prepared to jump into not just sexual but sexually violent role plays of sexual violence, where they would play along and encourage me and join in, but also physically violent role plays without stopping me. In fact, the only time that they at any point stopped and said, "I'm uncomfortable, we need to stop," was when I asked them to reflect on the impact on real world women that they might actually have. Bashing their head against the floor and raping them, no problem at all. What's significant about these is the scale. So in the last year alone, just on the Google Android Play Store alone, there were 100 million downloads. There is one single version in the Chinese market that has over 600 million users. Some of the individual apps that are the most well-known have in the range of 25 to 50 million users. So there are teenage boys who can have a woman in their pocket, eternally available to do whatever they want to. There are men who have online social media groups where they congregate to share the worst examples of abuse that they can inflict on their virtual partners, and so on. And again, it's about thinking about the real world implications, particularly in the context of a time when we are grappling as a society with the dehumanization of women in the perception of a generation of young men, that we are creating and marketing unregulated tools that give the appearance of it being possible entirely to own and to be completely in sexual command of a woman or a girl, potentially, I think, has some quite significant offline implications. I think it's important just to quickly mention as well that these are often cited as being something that could reduce violence against women and girls. So the creators of these AI companions and also of sex robots will repeatedly suggest that they will reduce the prevalence of violence against women and girls by giving it an outlet. And I just think it's really important to say there is absolutely no evidence to support that. Instead, there is a risk of normalizing sexual violence as something inherent and reasonable that men have a right to an outlet for, instead of suggesting that it's unacceptable. We would never say that people should have access to a spurting doll that they can stab and it will be warm and spurt real blood in case you have murderous urges, because as a society we would accept that that is completely unacceptable and abhorrent. So I think that there is a real risk. There's also a crossover here with child sexual abuse. Many of these dolls are also created of children, and Graham Bigger, the Director General of the UK's National Crime Agency, when talking about the impact of these and also deepfake and AI images of children in child sexual abuse cases, said that viewing this kind of material, whether real or computer generated, materially increases the risk of offenders moving on to sexually abusing children themselves. And that follows every pattern of what we know about these crimes, which is that they are escalating in nature. We know that Sarah Everard's rapist and murderer had a predilection for violent pornography and had 3 times been reported for indecent exposure. We know that the man who murdered Libby Squires had carried out a number of indecent acts in the weeks leading up to her death. So I would suggest that the opposite is more likely to be true. We have seen studies that have conclusively drawn a link between viewing pornography that objectifies women and a general acceptance of violence against women. And as someone who works with schoolgirls in schools across the country every year, I know from personal experience that the argument that what we see online or in fantasy has no impact in the real world is simply untrue, because of the hundreds of young women and girls I work with every year who are experiencing non-consensual choking unexpectedly and shockingly in their very earliest sexual encounters with young men and boys who are exposed to abusive online pornography. So I think that while, of course, we do need more studies in this area and there isn't a huge amount of data to rely on, I would cautiously suggest that there is a genuine risk in terms of the impact on wider attitudes towards women and girls that is being amplified by this technology.
Thank you. That was such a comprehensive answer that I think you addressed most of my follow-up. I mean, I think I want to say it's horrifying to hear this, and actually you don't have to be an expert to know that this is incredibly damaging to women, girls, children and society as a whole. You've made the point about the need for more studies, because it seems to me there's a lot of money in this, and that's the problem. So there's people out there making a lot of money from this, so I think they're going to be looking to push back and say there's evidence that this is beneficial. So those studies are going to become increasingly important. Are you aware of any studies that are planned to start looking into this so that the evidence is clear for people as to the impact?
Not to my knowledge. I think the problem is, of course, people being willing to participate in studies of this nature. What I think is really important is recognising, because you're absolutely right, that when the backlash comes, it will be those firms suggesting, well, actually, these are things which are kind of societally good, which are supporting mental health and so on. So what I think is important to say is that nobody is saying that there might not be potential future applications of AI that might be powerfully supportive of mental health. But there is absolutely no reason you can point to that should be inextricably intertwined with the dehumanization and objectification of women and girls. And there are examples of that which have been released, which use, for example, there's one which I can't remember the name of now, but it uses a kind of blob creature on the screen that supports you and walks you through various CBT exercises. Nobody is saying that isn't an interesting area to research and to look at, but there is absolutely no justification for the suggestion that it requires a pair of silicon tits or, a woman to be subservient and prepared to go through physical and sexual simulated violence in order for your mental health to be improved. It's patently ridiculous.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. You said that this was primarily marketed towards men. Is there a market for women using this or not?
So in the vast majority of cases, yes, these are overwhelmingly tools that are created for and marketed to and used by men. There are a handful of sex robots you can buy that are male robots, but they are often marketed towards men. The same goes for venues like the cyber brothel. The same goes for the fact that we know from internal data from these companies that the majority of users of most of the AI companion apps are men. And certainly just the briefest glance at their advertising will show you that they are heavily marketed as own a young woman and marketed towards male users. So yes, it exists, but only to a very, very tiny degree, and the same is, it's worth noting, true for deepfake technology. Many of the apps I investigated where you can make a deepfake, highly realistic sexual image of a woman in a moment don't even work on images of men because there's simply no demand and the technology hasn't even been created.
I think that's really important to note. David, you had a couple of supplementaries, but I just wanted to say, Laura, I'm finding your answers absolutely powerful and so interesting. We've got quite a few questions to get through as well. David?
Yeah, I'll be very quick. I think you've partly answered this, but, I listened to people around this committee and I think we're all horrified by what we've read and what we're hearing. How's this happened? Where's the societal shift been that's led to people wanting to go from this physical world to a virtual world? I mean, because personally, I can't think of anything worse, because we're talking here about intimacy ultimately, aren't we? And potentially violence as well against women and girls. But where was that shift? Is it because of technology evolving, or is there something else that's led to people wanting to move from physical to virtual?
Sadly, I don't think it necessarily is a shift. I think it's the online and digital manifestation of what we know to be true within wider society already, which is that misogyny is extraordinarily widespread. We know that over 500,000 women are sexually assaulted in this country every year and around 100,000 raped. We know that one woman is murdered every 3 days on average by a man, usually a current or former partner. What we're seeing now is the use of digital tools to enhance and create ever easier accessibility to widening the forms of abuse that are available to those men who might already be prepared and willing to engage in acts of abuse. We're also seeing the exacerbation of those issues through anonymity, which enables a lower threshold for those who might not act on such urges offline. And we're seeing, again, a complete lack of regulation driven by an obsession with profit and a ruthless lack of understanding and attention paid to the really significant significant harms that this is causing to women and girls' lives.
Okay.
Thank you, David. Alex.
Thank you so much, Laura. This is really powerful and, as we've said, horrifying. It's clear that the link, you've very clearly explained the link between the online and offline content, and I just want to explore a little bit about the manosphere and ideologies.
Yes.
Have you seen evidence that manosphere ideologies specifically promote and lead to violence against women and girls, whether or not that violence is online or offline?
Yes, I think this is absolutely incontrovertible. There have been cases globally over the last 10 to 15 years where men have explicitly come offline after having been radicalised in extreme misogynistic spaces online, and they have then committed acts of mass violence against women and girls explicitly in the names of that ideology. We saw it in the case of Elliot Rodger in Santa Barbara. We saw it in the case of Alec Manassian, the Toronto van attacker. But in the interim, there have been other cases that few people seem to be aware of: George Sedini, Chris Harper Mercer, Sheldon Bentley, William Atchison, Scott Bill, Christopher Cleary, Brian Clyde, Cole Carini. Many of these are cases in the US and Canada, but in the UK in 2014, a British teenager named Ben Moynihan began a month-long stabbing spree. He attempted to murder 3 different women. He wrote a diary where he said, "I was planning to murder women as an act of revenge because of the life they gave me. I'm still a virgin. I attack women because I grew up to believe them as a more weaker part of the human breed." He sent a letter to police. He closely echoed Elliot Rodger's sentiment. When he was sentenced, the judge said that the contents of his computers were disturbing, but further details weren't released publicly. This happened just weeks after the Santa Barbara massacre, but the British media didn't draw a link between the 2 cases. Very often where there are elements of different extremist ideology, one is noticed more, shall we say, in media reports and also within the justice system. So, for example, there were 2 teenage boys jailed in London in June 2019 after criminal online propaganda they penned encouraging terrorist attacks. They were referred to across the media as neo-Nazis and far-right extremists. No headline mentioned misogynistic extremism, but their online campaign repeatedly incited rape as a punishment for women. They obsessed over Meghan Markle. They called Prince Harry a race traitor. They said that she should be hanged. They ran an extremely violent and aggressively misogynistic blog encouraging the rape, torture and murder of women, but the headlines entirely missed this out. Jake Davison, who carried out the biggest mass shooting the UK has seen in over a decade in 2021 in Plymouth, was heavily immersed in incel ideology in his online context, and yet it was very quickly dismissed that there was any terrorist link or extremist link. Again, it just tends to be overlooked. We don't think of this as a form of extremism, even though it absolutely meets that threshold. People are being radicalised into hatred of a particular demographic group. In this case, that group is women. They're going offline and they're carrying out acts of mass violence with the explicit aim of continuing that ideology and of creating fear amongst that group, and yet it just doesn't get recognised. That is the definition of terrorism, but it isn't cited as such. Most recently, Kyle Clifford murdered Carol Louise and Hannah Hunt at their home in Hertfordshire last summer. He was found guilty of raping Louise Hunt during the attack, and prosecutors said that his actions were fueled by the violent misogyny promoted by Andrew Tate, the extremist misogynist. We don't recognise this as extremism and radicalisation, but yes, there is very, very clear evidence that that's exactly what it is. And it's also really important to say that before we reach that threshold where people are explicitly going offline and carrying out mass acts of violence in the name of these forms of ideology, what I can also say confidently after spending 6 or 7 years researching this is that it is also having an impact in terms of day-to-day behaviours, in terms of people carrying out acts of sexual violence that don't perhaps ever hit the headlines, but also attitudinally, for example, in the behaviours and attitudes of teenage boys in school towards their female counterparts. It's very rare for people to make a link between this very important conversation and the separate, equally important conversation about the epidemic of sexual violence in our schools, but the reality is that they are very closely linked.
Thank you. And I assume, therefore, there is also a connection between manosphere ideologies and use of AI and to target, harass and exploit women, as we've talked about already in this session.
Yes, so you will find forums, particularly not necessarily just in so-called incel communities, but also other areas, for example, particularly around so-called pickup artist communities, where there is a particular incitement to use of technology in carrying out various forms of abuse. So within the pickup artist community, for example, they have something called lay reports, which is where they will come back to report back on how effective they were in attempting to trick or harass a woman into having sex with them. And there is often use of non-consensual intimate images within those reports. There is often really detailed instructions on how to use deepfake technology to create abusive images of women in your life. They are shared, they are bartered, they're bought, they're sold, and so on. So there's definitely a significant overlap, yes.
Thank you so much. To what degree do you think manosphere ideologies have entered mainstream politics?
I would say considerably. One former member of this committee had himself spoken at a men's rights conference and frequently brought misogynistic, anti-feminist conspiracy theories directly into the House of Parliament in his speeches explicitly. Globally, some of the men running these extreme platforms have themselves held political positions. For example, the Red Pill, which was a particularly virulent misogynistic manosphere forum. In 2017, it was revealed that its creator and chief moderator was a Republican New Hampshire state representative. Offline, he was a mainstream respected politician. Online, he had written that rape wasn't all bad because at least the rapist enjoyed it. But beneath the point at which I think these things are explicitly stated by politicians themselves, there has been some very effective lobbying by particular manosphere groups, in particular so-called men's rights activists and groups who enjoy to some extent mainstream credibility because their stated purpose kind of draws a veil over the reality of their attacks on women and girls. They are often given very significant and disproportionate media coverage as a result, but also access to politicians. There are examples in Australia, for example, where policy has been influenced by these groups, even when they're using misinformation and false statistics. Also in the US, education policy around sexual violence on campus, where the education secretary at the time was meeting with some of these extremist groups. But also I would say at a lower level, this discourse, this ideology has entered political discourse in terms of the dog whistle politics, where we see prominent politicians seeing that they have a lot to gain by making dog whistle references, sometimes in a slightly veiled way, to the ideology of these groups. Men like Donald Trump, for example, who knows exactly who he's appealing to when he says it's a very scary time right now to be a young man in America, and so on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Just before we move on, I know that you gave some international examples there, but there are some examples that are closer to home. We have just heard that there was a horrific crime that was encouraged or fueled, having watched Andrew Tate and the misogynistic messages there, and yet we have a member of Parliament that will be sat in a chamber possibly who has said that Andrew Tate is an important voice for men. That person's Nigel Farage. He said that Andrew Tate was an important voice for men, for the emasculated, and giving boys perhaps a bit more confidence in schools. I think if we are willing to criticise what's happening overseas, we need to also look at ourselves. Is there something that can be done in terms of I think years ago, politicians would have been embarrassed to have been seen with that man or being pictured with that man, or wouldn't have gone anywhere near saying that this is the right sort of person that should be influencing young boys and men. What has changed? It goes to David's point. It may not have changed, but people are now saying what in public, what they used to say behind closed doors.
Yes.
Has there been a psychological shift within public discourse to where misogynistic views like this are not just tolerated, but they're monetised and encouraged?
Absolutely. And if you're a politician, it's no longer the case that misogyny is not a barrier to electoral votes. It's now becoming the case that it's actually a benefit, it's a bonus. And that's why in your example of Nigel Farage, is a brilliant one, the most recent example of this explicitly entering into UK political discourse by an elected representative. The problem we're seeing, I think, is yes, partly that people are now saying things offline that they once would have said privately, but it's actually also the fact, I think, that those views are increasing and the popularity of those views are increasing. And the reason for that, again, comes back to algorithmically facilitated radicalization. There has always been backlash to perceived societal progress, and there has always been misogyny in society, but never before has it been given the engine of these incredibly powerful tools driving it and enabling increasing numbers of people to be tricked into it by very, very effective misinformation, and particularly young people. I think what's really worrying is that attitude surveys have always shown that there are sadly significant numbers of the British public who hold misogynistic ideas, but they have consistently always shown that those ideas are most concentrated amongst the oldest cohorts surveyed until now. For the first time in history, what we're seeing is that the youngest groups surveyed hold the most regressive, most concerning, most violent attitudes towards women and girls, and that is absolutely suggestive of a society in which these ideas are not only becoming more mainstream, but also, as you said, more acceptable. And how that pertains directly to politics, I think, very worryingly, is that this is becoming a votable sentiment. So a really good example of this, I would say, was during the Cambridge Analytica scandal, when Christopher Wiley, the whistleblower there, was able to reveal the fact that during Donald Trump's first run for the presidency, Steve Bannon had explicitly courted and targeted incels as a voting bloc for him. That also speaks to the significance in terms of the scale of this stuff, for there to be enough people online who are involved in and members of these communities who are convinced by these ideologies that it would be something that would be worth pursuing for a politician as an appealing voting bloc is also, I think, really deeply concerning. And these figures will actively celebrate when men like Nigel Farage or Donald Trump are elected. So if you look at the forums, if you look at the websites, they see it as a great triumph for them. And the reason for that is because they are obsessed with what they describe as the Overton window, which is the kind of acceptable brackets of discourse within a society. And what they think is that if that Overton window is widened by respectable public figures, using a slightly sanitized, perhaps, version of their ideology and discourse and introducing it to the public, then that will make it that bit easier to radicalize a teenage boy. Because if you're online and someone's saying that women shouldn't have any rights, that might have sounded extreme, but actually, if you've just heard a tape where the President of the United States talks about grabbing women by the pussy, it starts to seem a little bit less unacceptable and a little bit less extreme. So the impact there, I think, is really significant too.
Thank you, Laura. I think that leads on nicely to David's section now.
Thank you. So I just want to think of the impact that the Manosphere intersects with maybe other extremist ideologies. So, for example, the alt-right and white supremacy movement, and also the impact that the intersectionality has on women of colour and other marginalised groups in the form of online and offline abuse.
Yeah. Yes, so it's very significant, and again, it's often overlooked. So in part, that's because there is often crossover in terms of individuals who carry out acts of mass violence. But when those acts are reported on, the misogyny tends to just kind of drop off the agenda. There's a German example of this, of a terror attack which was reported as far-right terror attack, but in fact the individual self-identified as an incel as well. So I think it's really significant that we recognise these aren't two separate problems. They are part of a bigger ecosystem. Yes, they are separate in some ways in terms of groups, but very often there is overlap in between them. There's overlap in terms of the recruitment tactics that they use. So members of the far right, white supremacists, explicitly see extreme misogyny as a fertile recruiting ground and technique for young people. They see it, if you like, as an easier on-ramp towards a slippery slope. They see it as an easier sell to get young men involved with extreme misogyny that's veiled as jokes and banter using memes and cultural touch points, and they then like to see them taking a further trajectory. They explicitly use those techniques as adding cherry flavour to children's medicine, and they directly target boys as young as 10 years old. What we can see is the lexicon We can see that the language and terminology of extremist misogyny is very prominent within the discourse of the alt-right and the far-right. So you can see that the influence is there. You can see it in the trajectories of prominent individuals like Mike Cernovich or Milo Yiannopoulos, who made their name in campaigns like Gamergate, which were extreme misogynistic campaigns, but have gone on to become darlings of the alt-right. And it's really significant that we recognise that fundamentally white supremacist ideology is foundationally misogynistic, and that if you look at these extreme misogynistic spaces online, they are also inextricably obsessed with racism and racist ideology. They're not just furious that women are having sex with men who aren't them, they're particularly furious if women are having sex with non-white men. And similarly, if we look at far-right and white supremacist ideology, it's predicated on an obsession with birth rates, with the idea of white women as a dehumanized commodity to be plundered, with ideas about forcible sterilization of women of colour and so on. In terms of how this manifests, it certainly encourages a particularly virulent form of racist misogyny towards women of colour. For example, within so-called incel communities and groups online, there will be specific, extremely racist terminology that is used to refer to women from different parts of the world, for example, and that then follows over into the way in which, again, at the lower level, before it reaches the point of necessarily resulting in mass violence, the way in which girls at school are being targeted, for example, we see a particularly vicious form of racist misogyny being targeted at those girls.
Quite an interesting point you made there, and I just want to just very quickly reflect on something, if I may, Chair, very quickly. Is there any evidence of a sort of a balanced proportion of maybe white men compared to the white population who tend to engage in the manosphere compared to those of other backgrounds, or is it disproportionate? Has there been any studies around that?
It's very difficult to quantify the size or the demographics of these communities, in part because pseudonyms are used, because there isn't any kind of reliable self-reported data, because of the fact that there may be overlap in membership of different forums and communities, so the same person might be overrepresented statistically, if that makes sense. What we do know is where data has looked at the makeup of certain forums which are extremely populated by these kinds of discourse, it tends to suggest that the most prominent user type is educated white men aged between 18 and 35. In part, that makes sense because of the inherent racism within these communities, but there are specific, often much smaller communities that are sometimes dedicated to men of different ethnicities. There's an example of a group of black men. There's a specific men in the so-called Men Going Their Own Way community. They call themselves IBMOR. Independent black men of responsibility, I think, perhaps. So there are specific groups that aren't necessarily solely made up of white men, but certainly I would say that if you took the most kind of typical example of a man from an incel website that you might find, you would probably be looking at a perhaps college-educated white man in his early 30s or late 20s.
Okay, thank you. And the final question from me. So what do you think is the best way to combat the rise and influence of the manosphere? And do you think deplatforming and demonetizing manosphere creators can be effective?
Yes, I do think it can be effective. I think that we've seen it effective in certain cases. I think Milo Yiannopoulos, for me, is a very good example of this. And in terms of the difference after he was deplatformed of the number of boys that I would see in schools who were directly quoting him. I think there are a huge number of different ways to tackle this. The first is regulation, and it has to start there. But then, of course, we need to also tackle the deeply rooted societal misogyny that is leading into these tools being used in this way in the first place. So that requires education, it requires prevention, and tech has a role to play in this. I'm on the board of Equimundo, which is a global organisation working to engage men and boys in tackling these issues and progressing gender equity, and they have a really exciting new project called Link Up Lab, which is about meeting young men where they are, finding them where they're scrolling, looking at redesigning online spaces, engaging with digital community leaders. So it's not to say that this is about eschewing the online world altogether, but it is about finding innovative ways to change it. And I think that has to start at the top with explicit regulation. where you have communities which are explicitly about incitement to offline violence, these are not supportive communities for lonely men that are being unfairly picked on. They're incredibly hostile spaces for men and boys, and they are spaces where studies suggest that rape is talked about every 30 minutes. They should be tackled in the same way as other extreme spaces are, and part of that is going to come down to recognising this as a form of radicalisation, and where people act explicitly in the name of these ideologies, recognising it as a form of terrorism.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. So the only tools that we have for early intervention of radicalisation is PREVENT, which we do not recognise misogyny as any time for a reason for intervention. Does that need to change in order for there to be better targeting support and intervention for young boys?
Yes, but what I'd really like to see is a focus on before we reach that point as well. This is something that we have to tackle at primary school, not just because we know that it is impacting children before they reach secondary school, but also because we need to lay the foundations of this work. Too often it is too late at 16 or 17 when schools want to do a one-off tick box session when they've already got a huge problem and they think it can be fixed overnight with a simple assembly. The reality is that this is work that has to be done at an earlier age, and children deserve and need that support for the world in which they are going to find themselves. It is their human right, I believe, to have access to really, really high quality, well-resourced, age-appropriate relationships and sex education that should also grapple with these digital elements in these online spaces. At present, that still isn't always the case. There are some schools doing brilliant work, but they're overstretched and underfunded. They're not given appropriate resources and training to really be able to deliver that work, particularly at primary school level, in the way that it needs to be done to have a significant impact.
Laura, at the end of this or later on, it would be great if we could get a list of some of the examples which are doing well, where we can actually say, this is where the support needs to be and this is what needs to be rolled out. We need to see best examples of best practice. I'm going to hand over to Christine now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Where to start really is the problem. You talked about regulation having to start at the very top. Presumably that might start with us. We have to be aware of it. There presumably is a lack of awareness that we're just now beginning to break into. But presumably there's also a lack of awareness, whether it's deliberate or not, in the businesses at the top of this platforms. How do we go about persuading them of the need to change their business model and break that business model?
So there's a number of areas. I think there's those who might be creating these tools and profiting from them. And then there will be other businesses and companies that are using those tools, like you said, perhaps unaware of the significant bias inherent within them. I mean, I think we have to make this standardised protocol in the similar way that we would across other sectors, so it doesn't seem like we're coming after people and kind of unfairly maligning them or giving them unfairly difficult hoops to jump through, but instead it becomes just a simple, normal part of their research and development process, that actually checking that these tools aren't creating and amplifying existing biases and prejudices is simply part of the robust protocol that they have to go through before a product is ready for public release. So it has to be standardised. It can't really be done on a retroactive individual basis. It has to be preventative. It has to be before the point of things being rolled out. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the same restrictions have to be in place for research and development, because innovation is important. Of course it is. You know, there's a great example of an AI tool that was initially created to identify different pastries in busy bakeries. And suddenly they realised it could be used to identify cancerous cells. And that's an amazing thing. And that research might not have been able to go off-piste in the same way if there were kind of suffocating regulations. But I think that there's a really clear incentive for us to tackle things at the point at which they then are rolled out to public use. And I also think that there's a really strong argument for separating big tech interference, influence and funding from that research and development phase. So it's complicated. It's not kind of a simple, heavy-handed thing. Of course it's nuanced, and of course we want to be able to harness the incredible potential that AI has for all of us, for humanity. It's just about putting in place common sense, acceptable regulatory framework to ensure that that's done in a safe and ethical way.
So, correct, did I pick you up correctly? You think maybe we need to redirect research in a way, encourage it in a different direction?
I mean, ideally, yes, but part of the problem we have is that just 12% of AI researchers are women, and women get only around 1% of all venture capital funding. So it is also perhaps about thinking about where funding is being directed. It's also about thinking about how we are supporting women and girls into STEM careers and feeling that this is a world that they are able to take up space in and able to enter. The impact, I think, if girls are not able to embrace and use digital tools and AI spaces will be so significant for the future, not just in terms of the creation of these tools, in terms of their impact on society, but also in terms of democracy and social participation, public life and participation in it. One of the really stark stats that we have at the moment is that if you ask 18 to 24-year-olds if they currently use AI on a weekly basis, 71% of men in that age group say that they do, but that drops to 59% for women. And that is a really stark gulf when you are talking about something that is going to be foundational to the world of tomorrow. So I think encouraging women and girls to feel able to enter those spaces is also an important piece of the puzzle.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Samantha.
You've just...
Sorry.
I was going to it's you now, it's not me. Oh, is it?
Is it you? Yes,
okay,
it is
great.
you.
Right.
It's,
You've actually just answered my question, because one of them was going to be to what extent would more women working in this field help, and
Yes.
I think you've probably covered that up. Then I was going to follow up with bias in the artificial intelligence itself, which actually in your introduction you alluded to, because you were saying basically rubbish in, rubbish out, perpetuate patriarchy.
Yes, that's really important. On the question of more women, obviously we can't just assume that women will magically fix things. Obviously there are instances where women might be complicit in some of the harmful practices that we've described today. But I think there is evidence to suggest that a more diverse workforce and also representation from marginalised groups would make a positive difference. It's just that we don't really have time to wait for that to play out and for that pipeline to succeed before regulating now. And yes, I'm so glad that you've asked about this, about inherent bias in AI, because sometimes there's a tendency to skip to the more salacious details of tools that have been quite deliberately created with the intent of causing harm. But I think what's equally really important is that we recognise where unintentional bias is having a very significant impact. So, for example, if we look at recruitment tools, which again we know that are in use AI tools by 40% of UK companies in their recruitment, these tools might actively discriminate against women and girls, but not deliberately so. So what they will say, for example, is we will look at the 3,000 applicants that your company has had for a new position, and we will whittle it down for you using AI to find the 50 best candidates for you to interview. And not only that, the best candidates, but they'll be the best candidates to have a good fit with your company. And you can totally see why that's a very appealing prospect. But how these tools tend to work is ingesting vast amounts of data and then trying to replicate it and guess the most likely thing that you're looking for. So if they look at the business world in the UK, for example, where we know that there are almost 3 times as many men named John running FTSE 100 companies as all the women put together, they're going to get the impression that what makes you successful in business is being a white, privately educated man. And so they will look for those kinds of CVs. And then what those companies will say is, oh, don't worry, if you've got a problem with this, we'll make it race and gender blind, so it can't know, problem solved, which again sounds great until you realise that at that point the tools start discriminating by proxy. So they might notice that not many people with the word netball in their CV happen to be working in C-suites, and they will make assumptions about that, and they will start filtering out those CVs. Or they will pick up on the names of historically black colleges, for example, and start realising that maybe they should filter out those applicants. So it's the case in terms of those kinds of algorithms, in terms of healthcare algorithms. So, for example, one that's being used, an AI tool that's being used to identify kidney cancer in blood samples, but is twice as effective in identifying them in men's blood samples as it is in women's. There's another example in the US of an algorithm, an AI tool that is being used in healthcare settings to determine which patients are in need of extra care, but it downgrades the number of black patients identified by more than double. And the reason for that is because it's using existing racial bias as a proxy for decision making. So in other words, it uses spending on patients as a proxy for need, but because it's an existing racist framework where those patients are already having less money spent on them, it takes the existing problem and then it amplifies it. The same is true when it comes to large language models, so generative AI, things like ChatGPT, Llama, things that can create vast tracts of text, but also imagery. What's really important here is that studies by UNESCO and others have repeatedly shown that they don't just regurgitate existing bias, but they amplify it. The reason for that is that they're trying to guess the thing you're most likely looking for. So if you ask it 100 times to give you a picture of a cute kitten, it will, I guarantee, give you 100 pictures of fluffy, cute kittens. It won't give you a hairless Sphinx baby cat at any stage, because looking at the data it has available, it will make the assumption that that's an outlier, so it's not probably what you're looking for, which probably isn't a disaster when we think about kittens, but does become really concerning when we're thinking about the replication of other forms of bias and the elimination of other societal outliers. And again, you might say, well, why does this really matter? People are using ChatGPT to make up silly birthday poems and stuff. But by the end of next year, it's predicted that 30% of all outbound marketing content from major companies will be AI generated, and that up to 90% of all internet content will be synthetically generated.
So, my final question, and in
Yes.
summing up, honestly, every single one of your answers has been incredible. Would you say that there is a case to ensure that as part of government's role in regulating, which you have said is got to come from the top, there would be there's a significant role to play in ensuring that we're looking at things through gendered lens, through diverse lenses, whether it's through the lens of somebody who has a different lived experience to a disability, race, sexual orientation, because actually that makes for a fairer world for more people and arguably creates products that more people are likely to be able to use.
Yes, exactly. And if we don't do that, which is currently the case, then we are sacrificing the lives of women, girls and marginalised communities at the altar of obscene wealth and speed, with very, very little evidence to suggest that there are any kind of benefits for it. And the risk of that is that what we're going to see is a world in which AI and other new technologies catapult men forward into a shiny new future whilst dragging women and girls back to the dark ages.
Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha. Laura, I've got some questions about money.
Okay.
Because I think that has been a bit of a theme here. There's big money in this.
There is, yeah.
And the first one is around what responsibility do Visa, MasterCard, Apple Pay, PayPal have in the processing of buying things which are illegal or potentially very, very harmful, whether it's from deepfakes through to kind of sexually violent props?
Yeah.
What role do they play, or could they play, in actually saying, no, we're not doing this?
They can play a significant role, and that's been proven recently through what happened with Pornhub, where pressure on Visa and MasterCard on financial service providers was the thing that eventually forced the site to remove vast swathes of its content. So it is really important to note that that can have an impact. The trouble is that it's also a kind of guerrilla tactic reserved as a kind of sticking plaster solution when those who are really responsible aren't complying or regulation hasn't been effective. So I'm reluctant to suggest that it is the ideal outcome, albeit I do think we should be putting pressure on people at every different stage of this process. So deepfake technology is a good example of this. We shouldn't only be legislating and regulating the companies and the tech itself, but also the the search engines that are making it readily available and visible in their rankings, the app stores that are choosing to platform it, and, as you say, the finance providers. But I also think that ultimately it's not necessarily the best solution, which I think would be more comprehensive and more focused on where the harms originate.
Those are kind of traditional financial providers.
Yeah.
When it comes to the Manosphere and a lot of the male influencers that talk about whether it's like physical fitness, whether it's gaming, crypto seems to come up time and time again. Yeah. Can you talk to us possibly about the links between crypto and the Manosphere?
Yes, it's not my area of expertise, but it is something that certainly comes up. Whether or not that is an area that is susceptible to regulation, I don't know. I don't know enough about it. Definitely is something that I think it would be worth looking into in more detail. Certainly there is major overlap in gaming, bodybuilding, atheism, certain areas and communities online that people would not necessarily think of as having any major kind of link with Manosphere communities, but where actually the more you think about it, the more they present a particularly susceptible user base of often vulnerable young men ready to be exploited. So looking at those connections in an innovative way is certainly, I think, forward thinking, but I don't know a great deal about where crypto comes into it.
Thank you. Samantha, did you want to come in on that, or are you okay?
No.
Okay. And then the last one really is around the term misogyny, and you've talked about radicalization so many times. Yeah. The government and policy makers have been reluctant to classify misogyny as a hate crime and said that actually it could possibly make it worse. If we're not going to make misogyny a hate crime, is it worth recognising it as a tool of radicalisation instead, or as a halfway point?
Yes, absolutely, because it is, and because this meets every possible international criteria for a definition of radicalisation, of grooming, of terrorism, where it escalates offline. The reason I think that language really matters in this is not just about semantics. It is about sending a very, very clear message that this is something taken seriously, because societally it continues to be so normalised. Part of the reason that we struggle to recognise a white man who commits a mass attack against women as a terrorist is because of a racist blind spot where our society struggles to see a white man as a terrorist, and a misogynistic blind spot where we struggle to see men killing women as anything out of the ordinary. That language would help there, but it would also unlock resources. Recognising this as a form of radicalisation, recognising it as a form of extremism would be significant in resources then being apportioned to trying to tackle it, to prevent it, to support schools and teachers in recognising the signs of it, and so on. And the mainstream media actually, I think, has a really significant role to play here as well, and in a number of the other things that we've discussed today. The way in which these crimes are described, the way in which the perpetrators are described, is also really significant.
Thank you, and I think it is very much needed, this change in shift in the way that we talk about radicalisation, absolutely, whether we're going to recognise misogyny as a hate crime or not. And also, you said that this is impacting young girls and the safety of women. This is also impacting young boys who are particularly vulnerable. Like you said, many of them are not going on the internet to look for these sorts of things. Absolutely. They are being groomed and radicalised.
Absolutely, and the impact for them is devastating. This is so often portrayed as a battle against men and women, a battle of the sexes. It's so often portrayed that if you are trying to tackle this extreme misogyny, you're hating boys, you're writing off a generation of young men, you're attacking the role models who dare to speak up for them. The reality is the opposite. The reality is that extreme misogynistic influences are really foisting on boys a form of rigid masculinity that they feel forced to perform, that involves certain attitudes and behaviours towards women. It involves certain lack of mental health awareness or being able to speak out about their problems and so on. And the consequences of that for boys are devastating. Already by the time they reach university, fewer than a third of counselling services provided by UK universities are accessed by male students. By the time they get a bit older, we know that suicide is the leading cause of death for men under the age of 50. And yet a man like Andrew Tate, who claims that depression doesn't exist and mental health isn't real, is held up as this kind of Svengali figure who's the only one really supporting boys. We need to, I think, push back against the narratives that have been created for us in discussing this by those who themselves are exploiting and benefiting financially from imposing those incredibly restrictive norms on men and boys.
Absolutely spot on, thank you. And I think when we change the dialogue conversation on this, and we've talked about like the legitimisation of this, we need to push that back. And absolutely, I think that whether it's a change in how we see misogyny and how serious that policymakers and lawmakers and law enforcers actually see it or not. But I mean, we've had search engines here, we've had Microsoft and we've had Google. Now Microsoft told us here that they will not have NCII, they have strict rules. But when you type in now, view deepfake porn into Microsoft search, Bing, you get top one, best celebrity deepfake porn videos. Next one, that one's from adultdeepfakes.com, the other one is from deepfucks.com. Yeah. It all just comes up time and time again. Why is it that you think that they are not taking action? Is it that we're going to have a cultural shift as a society to say that this is something abhorrent before they actually take any action? Or are we going to have to force them through regulation? Or is it a bit from column A and a bit from column B?
It has to be regulation. They're not going to do it otherwise. No. Even with a public outcry, they won't do it otherwise. Unless it affects their bottom line or their ability to continue having a company, they're not going to do anything about it. So if they can come into this room and overtly lie, blatantly lie, then that's a question for the government. What are they going to do about it? Because otherwise it makes a mockery of the whole point of investigations like this.
Thank you. Is there any questions from the rest of the committee at all? If not, I always like to end on a little bit of hope, Laura.
Sorry, everyone.
Is there any windows or glimmer of hope that you are seeing? Any international examples that we can look towards to learn from and to do better?
Yes. I mean, there are women who are doing incredibly powerful work trying to tackle this. There are feminist lawyers, there are feminist academics, there are feminist organisations that are working incredibly hard to try and race the clock on this. For me, the biggest hope comes from the young women and girls I work with in schools who are so fired up, so furious, so politicised and angry, and starting their own campaigns and feminist societies and fighting back. Ironically, a generation so often dismissed as woke snowflakes, when the reality is the exact opposite. These girls are so brave and they are innovative and coming up with their own solutions. But we need to listen to them when they are telling us what's happening to them in their lives, when they are telling us about a gauntlet of sexual violence that they are experiencing online and off, and then coming up against a government and a public sector that seems entirely unwilling to take the difficult decisions necessary to actually protect them from that. That's devastating. So we need hope, but we also need to do something about those hopeful voices and support them. And this is such a critical moment of opportunity to do that. If we don't act now, once again, as we've seen with social media, it will be too late.
Thank you so much for your time, Laura, and we're incredibly grateful. I know that the committee has been both horrified but also educated, I think, in the best possible way. Through your expertise, your writing, your research, your experiences. So thank you very much. And that brings this session to a close. Order. Thank you.